The judge ordered a black general to remove her Medal of Honor, but what happened next ended his career. Take that thing off your chest. This is a courtroom, not a military parade. Judge Richard's voice thundered through the room, sharp, commanding, laced with the kind of arrogance that comes from 27 years on the bench, unchallenged and absolute. All eyes turned to the woman standing at the witness podium. 42 years old, Lieutenant General Natasha Washington, the first black woman in U.S. history to earn 3 stars in the military. She stood, tall shoulders squared, gaze unwavering, the Medal of Honor gleaming on her immaculate uniform. She wasn't a defendant, she wasn't even a witness. Natasha was there by choice to support the grieving family of a young soldier who had died under her command. A boy of 19 who saved 8 lives before giving his own in Kandahar. Now that family was being denied survivor benefits because of a cold bureaucratic error. Natasha's voice was calm, shaped by 3 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 decades of leadership. Your Honor, she said evenly, this medal is not for show. It was awarded to honor those who never made it home. I wear it for them. Judge Richard, a 61-year-old man who had never served a day in uniform, sneered. I don't care what it stands for. This is my courtroom, my rules. Take it off or be removed for contempt. A murmur swept through the room, filled wall to wall with veterans. Natasha had felt this coming. The stares as she entered, the whispers, the way the judge deliberately mispronounced her name as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. She drew a slow breath and gently touched the medal. 23 years of service, 5 valor commendations, 3,000 soldiers led. And now she was being treated like a disobedient child by a man whose greatest battlefield was probably morning traffic. With all due respect, Natasha said, her voice cutting clean through the tension, a tone that made the veterans instinctively straighten in their seats. This medal represents sacrifices you may never understand. Richard's eyes narrowed. There it was again, that quiet defiance, that unshakable dignity. He couldn't control her, couldn't intimidate her, and that enraged him. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a silver-haired veteran rose to his feet. Then another, and another. Within seconds, 15 veterans stood in silence, eyes locked not on Natasha, but on the man who had just disrespected everything she stood for. Natasha offered a faint, knowing smile. What they didn't know was that the entire exchange, the public humiliation, the judge's words had been quietly captured by 3 discreet cameras. Because for the past 6 months, Natasha had been documenting every racially biased incident connected to Judge Richard's courtroom, every word, every case, every silence, and this moment, it was the final nail. If this story moved you, hit subscribe to see how one man's prejudice, dismissed as a minor outburst, would become the most spectacular downfall in modern U.S. judicial history. Judge Richard slammed his gavel down, the sound cracking through the air like gunfire. Bailiff, remove this woman from my courtroom until she learns to respect authority. But what he didn't know was that the country was about to find out exactly what kind of authority he represented. The security officer, an Iraq war veteran named Rodriguez, visibly hesitated. He looked at Natasha for a long moment, torn, then finally lowered his head. Your Honor, I respectfully decline to carry out that order. I don't care what you think, Richard barked, his face flushing crimson beneath his black robe. Do your job or hand in your badge. Natasha remained still, eyes calmly tracking every movement, every word, while the tiny recorder hidden in her uniform collar captured it all. 6 months of meticulous preparation, all leading to this moment. General, a young woman sobbed beside her, the soldier's widow, tears streaking her cheeks. Please, just take it off. I can't lose anyone else. Natasha placed a steady hand on her shoulder. She felt the familiar weight, one she had carried since the age of 18 when she joined the army to escape poverty in Detroit. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 23 commendations, base commander by 35, and now treated like a criminal for wearing a symbol of sacrifice and bloodshed. Mrs. Roberts, Natasha whispered gently. There are moments in life where stepping back would dishonor everyone who gave everything for us. Judge Richard watched the scene unfold, his irritation mounting. There was something about this woman that made his skin crawl. It wasn't just her skin color, it was the way she stood there as if his equal. 27 years on the federal bench had taught him to sniff out who knew their place. This woman clearly didn't. Across the room, corporate attorney Jennifer Walsh whispered urgently into her phone. Yes, she's refusing to remove the medal. No, she's not backing down. Maybe we should reconsider, but the voice on the other end was cold, decisive. Keep pushing. Humiliate her just like we planned. Richard smirked, eyes narrowing. Decades in court had taught him that breaking strong spirits was an art, and over the years he had perfected subtle techniques for putting black men and especially black women in their place, all without ever saying the quiet part out loud. Last chance, Richard growled, leaning forward. Remove that medal or be held in contempt. And spare me the war hero speeches. I know you're kind. Silence fell like a hammer. Even the lawyer stopped whispering. A few veterans clenched their fists, faces flushed with the effort of restraint. In the second row, a freelance journalist named David Chun slowly raised his phone and began recording. He had a feeling he was witnessing history unfold unclear, yet if it would end in tragedy or triumph. Natasha smiled softly, maternally. The expression made Richard flinch. She had stared down raging four-star generals, survived Taliban ambushes, and led rescue missions that saved hundreds of lives. A small-town judge with delusions of power was just another obstacle, one she'd dismantle with precision and strategy. Your Honor, you're right about one thing, she said, her voice firm, steady, echoing with the weight of a whole army behind it. You do know my kind. We're the kind who don't bow to men who abuse their power to mask their own insecurities. With that, Judge Richard exploded, hurling the gavel off the bench. Arrest her. Contempt of court. And in that moment of blind rage, Natasha knew he had walked right into her trap. Every word, every glare, every abuse of power recorded, documented, and now being streamed in real time to 3 civil rights organizations waiting for the signal to strike. He had no idea that his outburst, so saturated with racial bias, was being recorded in high definition, and in just a few minutes, his 27-year career would collapse under the weight of millions of eyes, all of whom would never forget the name Natasha Washington. Rodriguez hesitated for 3 more seconds before stepping toward Natasha, his hands visibly trembling. General, I'm sorry. Orders are orders. I understand perfectly, Soldier Natasha replied softly, extending her wrists. You're just doing your duty. Judge Richard watched the scene with smug satisfaction. Finally, the arrogant woman had bent. Finally, someone understood what order looked like. This is why I do what I do, he muttered to his clerk, eyes gleaming with triumph. But what he didn't know was that for the past 6 months, Natasha had been quietly documenting every single case that passed through his courtroom. 23 cases involving black veterans, every single one receiving harsher sentences than their white counterparts. Every unjust ruling, every biased remark whispered behind closed doors, every disdainful glance. All of it recorded, categorized, and sent piece by piece to retired Colonel James Mitchell, her former mentor at the military academy, now a renowned civil rights attorney. And as the cold metal of the cuffs clicked around her wrists, Natasha smiled inwardly, recalling the conversation she'd had with Mitchell just the week before. Patty, he'd said, using her old Army nickname, if that judge is who you think he is, then a public confrontation will be our Christmas present. Guys like him always hang themselves when they think no one's watching. Richard stood up, savoring every second of what he believed was a crushing victory. Let this be a warning to anyone who dares challenge the authority of this court, he declared with theatrical arrogance. I don't care how many medals you have pinned to your chest in this courtroom, I give the orders. The spectators remained silent, not with submission, but with a rising undercurrent of resistance. But Natasha saw what Richard didn't. Three people discreetly recording with their phones, including David Chun, the freelance journalist in the second row. More importantly, the young widow still seated was now whispering into a phone. That wasn't just a coincidence. That was part of the network Natasha had quietly built over the past few weeks. "You may all be seated," Richard's snapped voice dripping with condescension. "The show is over." As Natasha was led toward the side door, her eyes met those of an older woman seated quietly in the last row. Silver-haired, composed, retired federal judge Rebecca Chun, one of the most respected figures in American jurisprudence. Her presence was no accident. Chun was there at Natasha's personal invitation, officially to observe the proceedings. But in reality, she was the most credible witness imaginable, ready to testify about everything that was about to unfold. Rodriguez opened the holding room door, visibly uncomfortable. "General, is there anything I can get you water? A lawyer?" "Thank you, Rodriguez," Natasha said calmly. "As a matter of fact, my lawyer's already on the way." Natasha discreetly checked the tiny signal transmitter hidden in her military badge. A green light blinked. Everything was being streamed live to Mitchell's office, where three civil rights attorneys sat waiting habeas corpus petition already in hand. Meanwhile, back in the main courtroom, Judge Richard was raising his coffee cup, boasting proudly to a group of corporate lawyers. "You see that? I just gave that general a lesson she'll never forget. 27 years on the bench. I know how to bring the difficult ones to heel." Jennifer Walsh, lead counsel for the corporation, frowned slightly. "Judge Richard, with all due respect, perhaps, we should reconsider our strategy. General Washington has a significant reputation, and reputation." Richard interrupted with a loud laugh. "What reputation?" "For being a woman who doesn't know her place in society." "Please. By the end of the day, she'll be walking out of here with her tail between her legs." Case closed. Done. What Richard didn't know was that across the city in the offices of Mitchell and Associates, 12 monitors were live streaming everything that had just happened. 3 national civil rights organizations. 5 major media outlets. 2 members of Congress. All had been briefed beforehand. All were just waiting for Natasha's signal. 30 minutes later, when Rodriguez returned to announce that Natasha's lawyer had arrived, she smiled. But Mitchell hadn't come alone. A full team entered the courthouse, 2 investigative journalists, a federal prosecutor who had been quietly gathering evidence of racial bias in local courtrooms for months, and most notably retired federal judge Dr. Rebecca Chun, officially registered as a courtroom observer. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Judge Richard remained lost in the fantasy of his imagined victory. He had no idea he had just made a fatal miscalculation. He had completely underestimated a woman who had once commanded 3,000 troops in an active war zone. A woman who knew better than anyone how to plan, execute, and win, especially against enemies far more powerful than herself. When the courtroom doors swung open and Mitchell entered, followed by an entire delegation, Richard's face paled. For the first time, he felt a twinge of real fear, but this was only the beginning. Behind Mitchell walked 2 federal prosecutors, 3 investigative reporters, Dr. Rebecca Chun carrying a thick briefcase stamped with federal authority, and finally, Congressman Williams, chair of the Congressional Civil Rights Committee. What is the meaning of this?" Richard tried to keep his voice firm, though sweat already beaded his brow. "This is a closed hearing." Mitchell offered a polite smile, one that never reached his eyes. "With all due respect, Your Honor, as of this moment, it's now a federal investigation." He nodded toward an elegant woman entering with a recording device. "This is Amanda Foster, representative of the Federal Justice Commission. We have a few questions regarding your legal conduct, Your Honor." The color drained from Richard's face. He looked around and realized every single person in the room was recording. Personal phones, professional cameras, and the official equipment of the commission. His humiliation was being documented from every angle imaginable. "Release," General Washington immediately snapped District Prosecutor Davis, flashing his badge, and prepared to answer for 28 alleged incidents involving the denial of rights to black military families over the past 3 years. Richard stood frozen. How did they know the exact number? He turned to Jennifer Walsh for help, but the attorney was already on her phone, likely reporting that the plan had completely fallen apart. Rodriguez rushed forward to unlock Natasha's handcuffs, his hands trembling with emotion. "General, I I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do." "You carried out your duty, soldier," Natasha replied gently, adjusting her uniform. The Medal of Honor still shone proudly on her chest. No tears, no bowing of the head. "This is a misunderstanding," Richard shouted, his voice cracking, trembling. "This woman disobeyed a direct order. She disrespected me in public." Amanda Foster stepped toward the bench, switching on a federal recording device. "Judge Richard, you are under investigation for systematic violations of federal civil rights. Anything you say can and will be used as evidence against you." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Richard scanned the room, searching for sympathetic faces, but all he saw were expressions of disgust, disappointment, and worse, pity. Mitchell opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. Over the past 6 months, General Natasha Washington has documented every biased remark, every unjust ruling, every discriminatory comment made in this courtroom. 23 hours of audio recordings, 87 pages of documentation, witnesses from 17 different cases. Richard tried to rise, but his knees gave out. "This was a setup. She trapped me." Finally, Natasha stepped forward. Her voice echoed with calm authority. "Your Honor, I recorded only your words and actions. The only trap here is the one you built for yourself with your own arrogance and prejudice." Foster turned on the speakers. "We'll now play excerpts from General Washington's recordings." Richard's unmistakable voice filled the courtroom. "I know your type, a woman who doesn't know her place in society. People like you, it doesn't matter how many medals you've got." With every word replayed, Richard sank deeper into his seat. Several veterans in the room shook their heads in outrage. Some leaned forward to whisper words of encouragement to Natasha. Congressman Williams stepped to the microphone. "On behalf of the Congressional Civil Rights Committee, I am announcing a full-scale investigation into racial discrimination within this courthouse. Every case presided over by Judge Richard in the past 5 years will be reviewed." Richard's face collapsed into despair. He clung to the last shred of power he had, voice quivering with fury. "I've served for 27 years. You can't destroy all of it over one misunderstanding." Natasha slowly approached the bench, stopping just inches from the man who had tried to publicly humiliate her. She met his eyes squarely, her voice low but unshakably firm. "Your Honor, I spent 23 years defending this country and the values it stands for. You've spent 27 years betraying them. The difference is, I never forgot that serving the people is a privilege, not a weapon to shame the vulnerable." Amanda Foster powered down the recorder, then turned to Richard, voice clear and uncompromising. "Judge Richard, you are hereby suspended from the bench, effective immediately. A federal judge will be assigned to oversee this court during the investigation." 2 federal officers stepped forward to escort Richard from the very courtroom he once ruled. His steps faltered, his face flushed with shame. Camera flashes exploded like gavels, sealing his fate. Meanwhile, Natasha remained exactly where she was, calm and unshaken, her Medal of Honor gleaming on her chest, her dignity not just intact, but magnified. 28 military families who had once been denied justice had now been vindicated. But those flashbulbs didn't just capture the fall of a single man. They illuminated a much larger question: how many other Richards still exist within the system? And how did one black female general bring down an entire empire of prejudice, armed only with strategy, patience, and a hidden camera? 6 months later, Natasha strode confidently down the gleaming halls of the Pentagon, now the newly appointed Deputy Secretary of Veterans Affairs. The Senate had unanimously confirmed her nomination after the courtroom scandal had captured the attention of an entire nation. The Medal of Honor still gleamed on her chest, but it no longer stood solely for military bravery. Now it symbolized civil courage, justice, and a new hope for those who had long been overlooked. And Richard, he was removed in disgrace. Sued for civil rights violations, his law license revoked. And in the end, he was reduced to working the night shift as a security guard in a suburban shopping mall. The house he once lived in was seized, liquidated to pay restitution to the 28 veteran families he had wronged. At a national recognition ceremony, Rodriguez, now chief of security at the newly restructured federal courthouse, stood by her side, his voice trembling with emotion. "General Washington, you didn't just save those families. You saved all of us, everyone who witnessed your strength and dignity that day." The investigation sparked by Natasha's evidence had led to 17 judges removed from office, 143 cases reopened, and the creation of a new national oversight protocol to prevent racial bias in the judicial system. The widow of a fallen soldier hugged Natasha tightly during the ceremony. "My husband can finally rest in peace. The system recognized his sacrifice, and our daughter will go to med school just like he dreamed." Mitchell, now chief counsel for the National Veterans Affairs Committee, smiled and placed a hand on his former student's shoulder. "Patty, you turned a moment of personal humiliation into a nationwide reckoning. That's real leadership." In his official address, Congressman Williams declared, "General Washington's bravery reminds us real power doesn't lie in silencing injustice, but in recording it, confronting it, and turning it into lasting change." 2 years later, a frail man shuffled through the icy night, dragging his feet across the nearly empty parking lot of a suburban mall. A small badge on his chest read, "Night Security, Shift 3. It was Richard, once a federal judge, once a man who passed judgment on thousands, now forgotten. His name forever linked with disgrace and systemic prejudice. No one in his family spoke to him anymore. His wife left, his daughter refused to see him, his wealth gone consumed by settlements and legal fees. Whenever a passerby came too close, he kept his head down, afraid someone might recognize him. Some nights he stood in silence outside an electronics store, watching reruns of the very news segment that had destroyed his career. The report, of course, wasn't about him. It was about the woman who had taught an entire country the true meaning of honor. In Washington, D.C., the front lawn of the White House was overflowing. Thousands of veterans, civilians, and journalists had gathered for a historic moment. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian honor, was being awarded to General Natasha Washington. She stepped onto the podium to thunderous applause. The president, a woman of color, the first to ever hold the office, spoke with a breaking voice. She didn't just lead soldiers in wartime. She led an entire nation in peacetime, fighting injustice without ever raising a weapon. She is living proof of a greater truth, that a woman, a soldier, a Black American, can change the course of history. When the medal was placed on her chest, Natasha didn't shed a single tear, but everyone watching did. In the seats of honor, Rodriguez sat with his wife and children, eyes rimmed red. Mitchell stood with his hands behind his back, proud as if watching his own daughter come of age. And the hundreds of veteran families once ignored now sat tall with their heads held high. Months later, Natasha turned down the offer to become secretary. Instead, she moved back to the South and founded the Jalen Washington Center for Civil Leadership, named after her late husband, Captain Jalen Washington, who had fallen in Afghanistan. Each month, hundreds of students, young veterans, and activists came to learn from her how to document injustice using law and technology, how to turn a personal struggle into a social movement, and above all, how to protect your dignity even when the world tries to strip it away. Etched into the main wall of the center were her words: "Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's standing up even when the whole system tells you to bow." Natasha Washington. 5 years later, an 18-year-old girl received a full scholarship to study medicine at Johns Hopkins University. She stood at the podium holding the first speech of her academic life. I'm the daughter of a soldier who was once denied his rights. Today I get to study because one woman dared to record, dared to fight, and dared not to stay silent. Her story taught me that we don't always have to wait for a seat at the table. Sometimes we have to rebuild the whole room. The hall rose to a standing ovation. That girl was the daughter of the woman who once wept in front of Natasha pleading for help. Now she was on the path to becoming a doctor and a part of the generation Natasha had inspired. From a moment of public humiliation, Natasha had not only reclaimed her own honor, she had exposed systemic injustice, lifted hundreds of families, and ignited a national movement for reform. Not with power, not with weapons, but with integrity, patience, and a belief that in the end, justice will prevail. Thank you for watching. Don't forget, like the video if you believe justice can come from the smallest voices. Subscribe so you never miss more powerful and true stories like this one. Comment if you've ever stood up for someone you love, even when no one else believed you.